Pre-dawn turned the valley the color of old steel. It was the hour when shadows still owned the ground, and the first thin light hadn't decided whether it belonged to night or morning. From the ridgeline, the outpost looked small, an arrangement of Hesco walls and antenna mass wedged into a crease of earth that never should have been occupied in the first place. A pocket of human geometry jammed into a natural kill box. Somewhere beyond the eastern ridge, artillery thumped like a distant heartbeat. Not close enough to feel, yet but close enough to make the air seem heavy, like it was holding its breath. Down in the wadi outside the wire, 2nd Platoon didn't have the luxury of holding anything. They were pinned in a shallow cut of dried mud and stone, a winding scratch in the valley floor that offered just enough cover to survive and not enough to live. Machine guns on both ridgelines stitched the space above them with intersecting fire. Tracers arced red-orange in clean lines, drawing a brutal map of the kill zone. Every time someone lifted their head, the air above the wadi snapped and hissed like it was angry. Lieutenant Mark Dyer pressed his shoulder into the dirt, trying to make himself smaller. He tasted grit. He'd been in firefights before. Everybody had by this point, but this one felt different. This one felt designed. Falcon Actual to Falcon 6. He shouted into his handheld radio, voice cracking against the noise. Falcon 6, come in. We are troops in contact, grid. Static swallow the rest. Not normal static. Not the fuzzy, indifferent hiss of a bad antenna or weather. This was thick and deliberate, like someone had draped a wet blanket over the net. Beneath it, a faint rhythmic pulse beat through the silence. On, off, too steady to be anything natural. Dyer slapped the radio like it had insulted him. Falcon 6, this is Falcon Actual. Anybody? Nothing. He tried another frequency, then another. He got the same answer every time. Dead air in that pulse. Up the wadi, someone screamed, sharp, sudden, then cut off. Dyer didn't look. He couldn't afford to look, not if he wanted his brain to keep working. A mortar round landed 50 meters away. The impact was a deep, percussive thud, followed by a shockwave that shoved dust into their mouths and smoke into their eyes. The wadi filled with a brown fog that turned men into silhouettes and silhouettes into guesses. Another round landed closer. This one sent fragments clattering off rocks, a metallic hail that made everyone flinch lower. They're walking it in, Staff Sergeant Ruiz yelled, voice hoarse. He was somewhere to Dyer's left, pinned behind the same miserable strip of earth. They've got us bracketed. Dyer knew. He could feel it in his bones. This wasn't random harassment. It was a carefully timed execution. Across the valley, an enemy gun team shifted. Their bursts tightened, concentrating on one bend in the wadi where 3 soldiers huddled together around a wounded man. Dyer watched the muzzle flashes through the dust, bright and brief, like camera flashes at a funeral. Then crack. Not the chaotic crack of automatic fire. This was different. One clean report that seemed to cut a straight line through the noise. The enemy gunner jerked backward and vanished from his weapon as if yanked by an invisible hook. Half a second later, crack. The assistant gunner reached for the machine gun and folded sideways, collapsing into the dirt with his hand still open. For an instant, the enemy's stream of fire stuttered. The pressure on the wadi eased by a fraction, barely a breath's worth, but the soldiers felt it. They didn't understand it. They didn't have time to understand anything. They just took the tiny opening like a starving man takes a scrap of bread. Moo! Ruiz shouted. Drag him, drag him. Dyer's brain snagged on the impossibility. That machine gun had been set perfectly. Whoever dropped those men had to see it, had to have the angle and the comm to pick apart a crew in the middle of chaos. He looked up, squinting through smoke at the ridgeline. Nothing, just jagged rock and scrub and the beginning of dawn. Another crack. Another enemy silhouette fell, this time a man who'd been leaning out of cover with a radio handset. And then Dyer understood what he'd been missing. The fight had 2 tempos. The frantic, messy violence in the valley, and somewhere above it, a slower, quieter rhythm, like someone had stepped out of time. Later, in a cramped room that smelled of antiseptic and burnt electronics, he would try to explain it. He would say, Someone up there picked them apart while our radios were dead and the base was going under. He would stare at the tabletop and keep seeing tracers. He would keep hearing that pulse. He would also see the flight manifest, stamped and signed, the one that said, "Rotation complete, depart 0700." And he would remember the name on it. Sergeant Lena Ortiz. He would swallow hard and add, in a voice that didn't quite fit his rank, she wasn't even supposed to be on that hill. The debrief would catch the pause after that sentence, the weight of what he couldn't explain, the guilt that sat behind it. For now, in the Wadi, all Dyer saw was a spent brass casing spinning in the dust near a pair of worn boots on a ridge he couldn't reach. A bolt cycled with quiet, mechanical economy. A rifle barrel tracked left, searching for a new, unseen target. And then, hard cut, 12 hours earlier. The outpost in late afternoon looked almost peaceful if you didn't know what peace cost. Heat shimmered off the valley floor. Dust coated everything in a thin beige film, turning green camouflage into the same tired color as the earth. The perimeter walls were sun-bleached, pocked with old impacts, patched and repatched. Beyond them, ridges rose on both sides like the jaws of a trap that had learned to smile. Inside, the mood was wrong for a place like this. Men laughed too loudly. Someone had taped a hand-drawn countdown calendar to the wall of the operations room. Days until home. Names filled the squares like prison marks. Gear was half-packed. Rucksacks leaned against bunk frames. Someone's boots sat on top of a duffel bag like they'd already started walking away. In the TOC, Captain Harlan looked up from a stack of papers and grinned as Sergeant Lena Ortiz stepped into the doorway. Ortiz didn't look like a hero. She wasn't the kind of soldier who filled a room. She was average height, compact build, dark hair always tucked away, eyes that seemed to move less than everyone else's because they'd already mapped the space. She carried her rifle case like it was just another piece of equipment, not an extension of her body. Harlan tapped the top sheet. "Ortiz," he said, voice full of that half-serious, half-joking tone officers used when they were trying not to show relief. "You made it. Congratulations on surviving the valley." A couple of guys chuckled. Someone clapped slowly. Ortiz gave the smallest nod. "Sir." Harlan slid the paper toward her. "A manifest. Names, dates, times. After tonight, you're done," he said. "Low-risk Overwatch shift. Sunrise, you're on the bird out. Wheels up at 0700. You hear me? Don't get creative on your last night." Ortiz's eyes flicked down the list. She saw her name in ink like a line drawn under a chapter. She felt something that wasn't relief, not exactly. More like an itch under the skin. "Yes, sir," she said. Outside the TOC, the whiteboard that tracked patrol schedules hadn't changed in weeks. Same routes, same timing, same notes written by different hands. Routine. No contact. Locals friendly. Like writing it down made it true. That complacency hung in the air like a smell. The kind that came from living too long without being punished. Ortiz climbed the tower as the day bled into evening. The metal stairs vibrated under her boots. Up top, the wind was stronger, carrying the faint scent of burned trash and dry stone. The tower gave her what she always wanted, distance. From here, she could see the valley as a problem to be solved. She raised her optic and swept the ridge lines, slow and methodical. She didn't chase movement the way new soldiers did. She looked for absence, for pattern breaks. Near the broken culvert a kilometer down valley, the usual cluster of shepherds and kids wasn't there. They'd been there every day, like clockwork. A couple of goats, a few boys throwing rocks, older men standing off to the side pretending not to watch the base while they absolutely watched the base. Today, empty ground, and next to the culvert, a dump pile of fresh rocks that hadn't been there yesterday. Not scattered naturally, piled like someone meant to hide something behind it. Ortiz kept scanning. Across the far ridge, she noticed faint new footpaths cut into the scree. Straight, purposeful lines that didn't zigzag like goat trails. Human lines. She lingered, letting the optics settle. A glint, just a blink of reflected light, high up on the ridge. Glass-catching sun. Start to the point or what is entitled. Predawn turned the valley blue-gray. the kind of cold light that makes everything look already dead. Second platoon was trapped in a shallow wadi outside the outpost, pinned by 2 machine guns on opposite ridge lines. Tracers crisscrossed overhead like someone had drawn a cage in the air. Every time a soldier tried to crawl, rounds snapped stone inches from their faces. There was no flanking route, no smoke thick enough, no cover deep enough. Just dirt, fear, and geometry. Lieutenant Dyer jammed his radio to his mouth. Falcon 6, this is Falcon Actual. Troops in contact, requesting. The radio answered with static. Not normal static. This was layered, dense, almost mechanical, backed by a faint rhythmic pulse like a heartbeat that didn't belong to any living thing. He switched channels. He tried again. He slapped the battery. Same result, dead net. Radio's gone. Ruiz yelled from somewhere down the line. They're jamming us. As if to confirm it, the first mortar round landed behind them with a heavy thump. Dust punched into the air. A second round landed closer. Then a third. The impacts marched forward, walking the wadi like someone counting steps. Keep your heads down, Dyer shouted, even though nobody had heads up. The enemy gun team on the left ridge shifted, tightening their bursts to finish the job, concentrating fire on the bend, where 3 soldiers clustered around a wounded man. The machine gun's rhythm changed, faster, hungrier. The wadi became a funnel, and they were the bodies caught in it. Then, crack. One single shot. Clean. Precise. It didn't match the chaos. The enemy gunner jerked backward as if yanked by a wire and dropped off the weapon mid-burst. Half a beat later, crack. The assistant gunner reached for the feed tray and folded sideways, collapsing into the dirt with his hands still open. The machine gun fell silent. Not because they ran out of ammo. Not because they chose to stop. Because someone, somewhere, decided that gun didn't get to live another second. Dyer blinked into the dust cloud. He hadn't seen anyone move. He hadn't heard friendly fire from a wadi. The shot had come from above, high far calm. Another crack. An enemy figure farther up the ridge, someone holding a handset, probably directing the mortars, spun and crumpled. The mortar impacts stuttered, then drifted off target like a blind man swinging. For the first time in minutes, the platoon had breathing room. They barely understood why. Move, Ruiz roared. Drag him, now. The wounded man's boots scraped rock as they hauled him backward, taking the miracle opening before it closed. Dyer looked up through the haze toward the ridge line. Nothing visible, just jagged rock and scrub in the thin blue light. But the shots kept coming, one at a time, each one removing something that was killing them. A radio man, an RPG gunner, a machine gun assistant trying to reman the weapon. It was surgical. It was impossible, like a ghost with a rifle. In a later debrief, with his hands still shaking, Dyer would say the only words that fit. Someone up there picked them apart while our radios were dead and the base was going under. He would slide a flight manifest across the table, eyes on the stamped line that made no sense with the reality of what had happened. Rotation complete. Depart 0700. Ortiz, Lena, SGT. He would swallow and add, quieter like admitting a sin. She wasn't even supposed to be on that hill, because her deployment was over by morning. She had a seat on the aircraft. And yet, on that ridge, above the kill zone, a pair of worn boots pressed into dust. A bolt cycled with calm, mechanical economy. A single brass casing spun and settled beside her knee. Sergeant Lena Ortiz, already packed, already signed out in the system, turned back anyway. And she lined up the next target. Fucking right complete story. Predawn turned the valley the color of cold steel. It was the kind of light that made everything look unfinished. Half shadow, half truth, like the world was still deciding what it wanted to be. The outpost sat jammed into the crease of a remote border valley, Hesco walls and wire, and antennas pressed against rock like a bad idea that had become routine. High ridges on both sides watched it like blunt knives. Second platoon was outside the wire, trapped in a shallow wadi that should have been cover and had become coffin. Machine guns on the ridge lines carved the air above them into intersecting lines. Tracers snapped past in bright red streaks, drawing a brutal map. If you move, you die. If you lift your head, you die. If you try to drag a wounded man, you die slower. Lieutenant Mark Dyer pressed his cheek into gravel, breathing dust through clenched teeth, trying to make his body thin enough to fit between bullets. Falcon 6, this is Falcon Actual, he shouted into his handheld radio. Troops in contact requesting. The radio answered with static, not the fuzzy, indifferent static of a weak signal. This was thick, deliberate, a wet, heavy hiss that drowned everything out, with a faint rhythmic pulse underneath it, on off like a heartbeat that didn't belong to any living thing. Dyer switched channels. Static. He tried again. Static. He slapped the radio like he could knock the signal loose. Static. Higher can't hear us, he yelled, mostly to himself. Radio's dead. Staff Sergeant Ruiz barked from somewhere nearby, voice sharp with panic he tried to bury under command. They're jamming us, sir. As if the enemy wanted to confirm it, the first mortar round hit behind them with a deep, percussive thump. Dirt and rock jumped. Dust punched into the wadi and rolled like fog, filling mouths, eyes, lungs. A second round landed closer. A third closer still. They were walking it in, counting the wadi like steps. Bracket. Adjust. Kill. Dyer squeezed his eyes shut against the grit and forced them open again. Fear was there, hot, immediate, but fear didn't solve geometry. Up ahead, at the bend where the wadi narrowed, 3 soldiers were huddled around a wounded man. Blood was dark on the dirt. Their movements were frantic and useless. Hands pressing, hands shaking, hands trying to find a way to stop time. Across the valley, an enemy gun team shifted. Their bursts tightened, stitching the bend with hungry precision. The machine gun's rhythm changed, faster, meaner, like it could smell the finish. The platoon was about to be erased in the next 10 seconds. Then, crack. One clean shot cut through the chaos. The enemy gunner jerked backward and vanished from the weapon mid-burst, as if yanked by an invisible hook. Half a heartbeat later, crack. The assistant gunner reached for the feed tray and folded sideways, collapsing into the dirt with his hand still open. The machine gun went silent. Not because it ran out of ammo, because someone decided it didn't get to live another second. Dyer blinked into the dust, disoriented by the sudden absence of one of the killing noises. He hadn't seen anyone fire from the wadi. That shot came from above. High, far, calm. Another crack. An enemy silhouette farther up the ridge. Someone holding a handset, likely talking the mortars in, spun and crumpled. The next mortar round landed wide, off the bracket, as if the sky had lost its mind. The soldiers didn't celebrate. They didn't even understand. They just felt the pressure ease by a fraction, 1 breath's worth, and took it like starving men take scraps. Move, Ruiz roared. Drag him. Now. The wounded man's boots scraped stone as they hauled him backward, crawling inches at a time through dust and terror. Dyer looked up through the haze toward the ridgeline. Nothing visible, just jagged rock and scrub in thin blue light. But the shots kept coming, slow, exact, each one removing something that mattered. A radio man, an RPG gunner, a machine gun assistant trying to reman the weapon. It was surgical, impossible. Like a ghost with a rifle. Later, if any of them survived, Dyer would sit in a debrief room that smelled of antiseptic and smoke and stare at a table until his eyes hurt. He would say, voice shaky and wrong for a lieutenant, someone up there picked them apart while our radios were dead and the base was going under. He would slide a flight manifest across the table. It would have a stamp and a time and a line that made no sense with what had happened. Rotation complete. Depart 0700 Ortiz, Lena, SGT. He would swallow hard and add, she wasn't even supposed to be on that hill, because her deployment was over by morning. She had a seat on the aircraft. And yet, on that ridge above the kill zone, a pair of worn boots pressed into dust. A bolt cycled with calm, mechanical economy. A single brass casing spun and settled beside her knee. Sergeant Lena Ortiz tracked the rifle barrel toward a new target, and the story snapped backward. 12 hours earlier. Late afternoon at Outpost Kestrel felt like the last day of school. Heat shimmered over the yard. Dust coated everything in a beige film that made camouflage pointless. A whiteboard inside the TOC listed patrol routes like a menu. Route copper, route slate, route ash. Same timing, same notes scrawled by different hands. Routine, no contact, locals friendly. The outpost had lived too long without being punished. That complacency hung in the air like a smell. Men laughed loud. A couple of soldiers argued about what they'd eat first back home. Real burgers, real pizza, food that didn't come in a plastic pouch. Someone had taped a countdown calendar to the wall. Days until home. Names filled the squares like prison marks. Gear was half-packed. Rucks leaned against bunks. Boots sat on duffel bags like they'd already started walking away. Sergeant Lena Ortiz moved through it quietly, rifle case in one hand, small pack in the other. She didn't join the laughter. She didn't look like she needed to. She carried herself like someone who had learned the hard way that joy could be interrupted. In the operations room, Captain Harlan glanced up from paperwork and grinned. Ortiz, he said with that half-joking officer tone, relief pretending to be humor. You made it. Congratulations on surviving the valley. A few guys chuckled. Someone clapped slowly. Ortiz gave the smallest nod. Sir. Harlan slid a paper toward her. Flight manifest. Names. Times. Stamps. After tonight, you're done, he said. Low-risk Overwatch shift. Wheels up at 0700. You hear me? Don't get creative on your last night. Yes, sir. He leaned back. You're officially non-essential once that bird is staged. If things go sideways, you get on the convoy and you get out. That's not negotiable. Ortiz stared at the ink. Her name looked final. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt an itch under her skin. An old, familiar warning she couldn't explain to people who didn't live inside her head. She left the TOC and climbed the tower as the sun began to soften. Metal steps vibrated under her boots. Up top, wind pushed at her sleeves, cooler than the yard below. The tower gave her what she always wanted, distance. From here, the valley was a problem. A map, a set of patterns that either stayed stable or broke. She raised her optic and swept the ridgelines, slow, methodical. She didn't chase movement like new soldiers did. She looked for absence, for what wasn't where it should be. Near the broken culvert about a kilometer down valley, the usual cluster of shepherds and kids was missing. They'd been there every day, like clockwork. A couple goats, a few boys throwing rocks, older men standing off to the side pretending not to watch the base while absolutely watching it. Today, empty ground, and beside the culvert, a pile of fresh rocks that hadn't been there yesterday. Not scattered naturally, piled, intentional. Ortiz lingered, narrowing her gaze until the optic's glass framed the scene like a photograph. She scanned the far ridge. Faint lines across the scree slope. New footpaths, too straight to be goats. Human lines. Then, a blink of light. A glint. Just a flash, high up near a ridge spur. Glass-catching sun. It vanished the moment she centered it, like whoever held it knew she was looking. Ortiz felt the itch sharpen into certainty. She keyed her mic. TOC, this is Tower 1. Pattern break, down valley, near the culvert. Civilians absent. New rock pile. Possible movement. A pause. Then the lieutenant on duty, exhausted and buried in paperwork, answered. Copy, Tower 1. Probably locals rotated out. Keep eyes on. Also seeing possible observation glass on the far ridge, Ortiz added. Brief glint. Could be a spotter. Copy, the lieutenant said, but his tones said, we have 1,000 things. Your ghosts are number 1001. Ortiz stayed on glass. Down below, laughter carried from the chow tent. Someone shouted a joke. The day slid toward night, like it always did. Later at chow, the others talked about home like it was guaranteed. Ortiz sat on the end of a table and ate without tasting. Her eyes kept drifting to the map on the wall. Her finger traced the ridgelines, the culvert, the wadi outside the wire. She knew that valley like a scar. Across from her, Specialist Carter, the other sniper, loud and charming, the kind of guy commanders remembered, leaned back and smirked. You scanning ghosts again, Ortiz, he said, trying to ruin everyone's last peaceful night? A couple of guys laughed. Ortiz didn't. She just looked at him. Patterns change, she said. Carter lifted his hands. Hey, I'm not arguing. I'm just saying, maybe let the valley be the valley for 12 more hours. You're going home. Don't borrow trouble. Borrow trouble. Ortiz felt something cold behind her ribs. Trouble didn't need to be borrowed. Trouble arrived on its own schedule. When she was done eating, she went back to her corner of the barracks and laid her gear out with quiet ritual. Rifle, magazines, cleaning kit, batteries, water, a battered notebook with wind notes and sketches of terrain features. She checked her rifle the way some people checked locks before bed. Not because she expected the lock to fail, but because she'd seen what happened when it did. Before climbing the tower for her night shift, she stopped in the corridor by the hardened door with the warning labels. Authorized personnel only. Classified. ISR data storage. It looked out of place in a dusty border outpost. Too reinforced. Too guarded. Too important. Ortiz stared at it for a second longer than necessary. Then she kept moving. Night settled in, and with night came the shift change. The relief guard was late. A patrol was prepping to step off. The base entered that brief, vulnerable lull where everyone was moving and nobody was fully set. Ortiz was back up in the tower, scanning through NVGs. The valley was darker now, a black bowl with faint starlight and the occasional glow of a cigarette someone shouldn't have lit. She heard it during a routine radio check. For half a second, the net cleared, just enough for her to think maybe everything was fine. Then the hiss slammed in. Artificial. Pulsing. On off. Ortiz's spine tightened. She keyed the mic TOC, Tower 1. Interference on the net. Strong. Pattern suggests deliberate jamming. The lieutenant sounded irritated. Tower 1, copy. Might be atmospherics. Pull what you've got. We're in the middle of rotation paperwork. Atmospherics. Ortiz forced her voice steady. Understood. She went back to glass, but her hands felt colder. Down valley, near the culvert, 3 figures moved. Not villagers. Dark clothing. Purposeful. They crouched at the rock pile and began pulling stones aside. Ortiz's breath shortened. That pile wasn't a pile. It was a lid. They cleared it to reveal a pre-sighted firing lane, sandbags, a tube launcher, the outline of a machine gun position pointed straight at the base. Just Ortiz began, but she didn't even get the warning out. An RPG whooshed from the culvert area and slammed into a parked vehicle inside the wire. The explosion punched light into the night and threw metal into the air like angry confetti. At the same moment, machine guns on both ridges opened up. Automatic fire raked the towers. Tracers arced into the yard. Men shouted. Someone screamed. The base went from sleepy routine to violent panic in a single breath. Ortiz ducked instinctively, then forced herself back up, eyes to glass. Fear rose hot in her throat. She shoved it down. Contact! Contact! The radio net screamed, but the larger net was gone, smothered under that pulsing hiss. Internal comms were distorted too, garbled by interference that made voices sound like they were speaking underwater. Down below, the platoon that had been prepping to step off was caught half-assembled in the open yard. Several went down immediately. The survivors scattered toward the perimeter and the wadi outside the wire, the nearest depression that promised cover, which was exactly where the enemy wanted them. Mortars began to fall, unervingly accurate, bracketing both the base and the wadi. The enemy had grids. They had timing. They had rehearsed this. Ortiz's mind snapped through the pieces. Culvert firing lane, ridgeline guns, mortar adjustments, jamming. This wasn't about killing a few soldiers and running. This was about cutting the base off, pinning the defenders, and buying time. Time to do something inside the wire. Her eyes flicked to the hardened server door in her memory like it was a bright mark on a map. She tried to raise higher headquarters again. Static in that pulse. She dropped to a backup radio she'd checked earlier, an old unit the base kept for emergencies. It worked, but only locally. The bigger world was still gone. Deliberate. Ortiz scanned the ridge again and spotted it. Through gaps in smoke and muzzle flashes, a truck parked behind a ridge spur with a strange antenna mast, angled like a crooked finger toward the sky. A jammer vehicle, protected by enemy infantry. The heart of the silence. Down in the wadi, a mortar fragment tore into Staff Sergeant Ruiz's leg. He didn't scream. He just made a sound like he'd been punched, then cursed through clenched teeth as blood darkened his pant leg. The wounded didn't just hurt morale. They changed math. They turned withdraw into carry. They turned minutes into seconds. Inside the TOC, someone yelled that their digital map was flickering. Someone else shouted for a runner. The outpost commander's voice rose above the noise. We've got 30 minutes before they breach or the ammo dump cooks off. 30. Ortiz's hands shook. Not from weakness. From adrenaline. Fear was present. Function was a choice. She chose function. But then the protocol hit her like a physical shove. A convoy that had been staged to take returning personnel, including her, out of the valley was ordered to move. Get non-essential bodies out. Reduce casualties. Preserve what you can. A squad leader sprinted up the tower steps, breath ragged. Ortiz. Orders. You're up. Grab your gear. We're moving you to staging now. Ortiz stared down at the wadi through the scope. Men pinned. Mortars walking. Machine guns chewing the air. The jammer truck pulsing silence into the sky. If she left, she would be obeying orders. If she left, she would be alive. Sergeant, the squad leader snapped. You're done. You did your shift. You get on the truck so we can clear non-essential personnel. That's protocol. Protocol. Ortiz heard another sound layered beneath the firefight. An old memory opening like a wound. A different valley. A different convoy. Her voice in a radio saying she'd seen something wrong. Tire tracks where there shouldn't be. Men on a ridge where goats didn't go. Locals missing from a market that was always full. Her warning dismissed. Then orders. Fall back. Don't get creative. Stick to protocol. She had obeyed. Later, she'd knelt beside a body bag and stared at a boot that stuck out from under the zipper. A boot she recognized. A man who had laughed with her the day before. That memory lived in her like a stone. It was why she never laughed too loud. It was why pattern breaks made her skin itch. The squad leader grabbed her arm. Ortiz now. Ortiz turned, moved down the tower, moved across the yard through smoke and tracer fire. She could feel the convoy's engine noise, could see the truck's taillights through dust. A path out, a path away. She climbed onto the truck bed with two other soldiers. The vehicle lurched forward. Then, as the base behind them flashed with another explosion, Ortiz looked up and saw it. A faint muzzle flash on the ridge. An enemy sniper nest. Not random. Not opportunistic, positioned to pick off anyone who showed themselves on the wall, to keep heads down while the breach team did their work. Ortiz's stomach clenched. This was coordinated. They weren't just killing, they were shaping the fight. Buying time to get inside. To that door. She made her decision so fast it felt like it had been waiting all along. Ortiz stood, grabbed the side rail, and jumped. The truck was already moving. The ground hit her hard. She rolled in dirt and pain, came up coughing, rifle case banging against her hip. The truck's engine roared as it accelerated away, someone shouting her name, a voice fading under gunfire. For a second, she was alone, truly alone, inside the chaos. Isolation. Then she ran toward a maintenance gate behind the base, cut through, and started climbing. It wasn't a route anyone briefed. It wasn't even a route anyone talked about. It was a crumbling, near-vertical slope of rock and dirt that looked suicidal in daylight, impossible in smoke. Ortiz had found it months ago during insomnia walks. She'd traced it with her eyes, with her hands, with quiet curiosity. She never told anyone because it sounded like a crazy idea. Now crazy was all she had. Mortar impacts sent cascades of rock down around her. Dust and smoke reduced visibility to a choking bubble. Every handhold felt like it might break off and send her sliding backward into the valley. Her breathing got loud in her own ears. Fear tried to take the wheel. She forced her mind into a narrow tunnel. Grip, step, breath. Grip, step, breath. Halfway up, a shockwave hit nearby. The ground shuddered. Ortiz's rifle slipped. The optic struck stone with a sickening crack. She froze. For a second, the world narrowed to that sound and what it meant. A cracked lens didn't just ruin clarity, it warped reality. It turned certainty into distortion. Ortiz lifted the rifle, checked the optic. Spiderweb fractures crawled across one edge of the glass. A choice hung in the air. Turn back. Obey protocol belatedly. Live. Or keep climbing with compromised equipment and maybe die for nothing. Ortiz swallowed dust, tasting grit like pennies. She thought of the body bag. She thought of the men in the wadi. She kept climbing. At the top of the slope, she found a goat trail, narrow, precarious, just enough ledge to prone out if you trusted your body not to panic. It arced behind the enemy's line of fire and gave her an oblique view down into the valley. Not the clean, straight shot everyone expected from a tower. An angle from the side, from behind, an impossible angle. Ortiz wedged herself into rock, pressed her cheek to the stock, and peered through cracked glass. The world bent slightly at the fracture, like looking through broken ice. She forced herself to adapt. She tested, adjusted, breathed. Below, the fight raged. The base was half smoke, half muzzle flash. The wadi was a moving line of desperation. And there, behind a ridge spur, was the jammer truck with its antenna mast like a crooked finger. Ortiz's mind built a ladder. Not a list of who she hated. A list of what mattered. Force multipliers first. The enemy sniper nest on a ridge. The mortar spotter adjusting fire. The jammer crew keeping the world silent. Then RPG teams. Then machine guns. Then the assault leader working toward the hardened door. She didn't have infinite rounds. She didn't have a team. She didn't have comms beyond local. She had one rifle, a cracked optic, and time that was running out. Silence. Then violence in single clean beats. Ortiz found the enemy sniper nest by tracking rhythm. Muzzle flash, recoil movement, the way defenders on the wall flinched at certain angles. She watched. She waited. When the flash came again, she put her reticle where the man would be a fraction of a second later, compensating for the distortion of the cracked glass. She squeezed. Crack. The enemy sniper's shape jolted, then slid out of view like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Down below, defenders on the wall moved for the first time in minutes. Heads popped up, rifles fired, bodies shifted. The oppressive precision of the enemy Overwatch loosened. Ortiz didn't watch the effect. She moved on. Mortar impacts were still walking, though less exact now. She scanned high ridge lines and caught the spotter, a figure silhouetted against the faint dawn, holding optics, making small hand gestures. Next to him, a second man held something that looked like a rangefinder. Ortiz's breathing slowed. Calm in her body. Chaos in the valley. She squeezed. Crack. The spotter folded. A half second later, she sent a second round. Crack. The rangefinder man dropped, optics tumbling down the slope. The next mortar round landed wide. The bracket broke. In the wadi, men who'd been waiting to die suddenly had a margin. Small, thin, but real. They crawled, dragged, pulled Ruiz's bleeding body backward inch by inch. Ortiz shifted toward the jammer truck. She couldn't see the entire vehicle. Smoke and terrain hid parts of it, but she caught the operator leaning out the side door with a laptop, glancing up at the antenna mast like it was a living thing. Ortiz fired once. The round punched into the door frame, forcing the man back with a jerk. She fired again, aiming for the exposed array. The antenna shuddered, sparked, sagged. Down in the base, someone shouted into a radio, and this time, there was a faint crackle of response. Not clear, not strong, but not nothing. The world began to leak back in. Falcon Actual, say again. A voice stuttered through static. Lieutenant Dyer's head snapped up like he'd been punched by Hope. He screamed coordinates into the noise, voice raw, desperate, half prayer. The enemy noticed immediately. This wasn't a band of amateurs. They adapted. Smoke popped near the jammer truck, thick and deliberate, obscuring the operator. Infantry shifted positions. A small team broke off from cover and started climbing, moving upward toward Ortiz's ridgeline, using shadows and rocks like they'd rehearsed this too. They didn't know exactly where she was yet. They just knew she existed. Ortiz watched them climb. Her stomach tightened. Fear knocked again. Function answered. She shifted back to the valley floor where an RPG team was lining up shots toward the wadi. Two figures, one holding the launcher, one feeding rounds. Ortiz fired. The launcher man dropped. The second man scrambled, grabbed the tube. Ortiz fired again. The second man collapsed. Below, the Wadi squad survived another minute. A cheap quadcopter drone rose from behind a ridge, buzzing, insect-like, circling toward Ortiz's general area. The enemy wanted eyes, wanted confirmation, wanted coordinates. The drone drifted closer. Ortiz could have stayed hidden and hoped it passed. But if it saw her, she'd be done. If it broadcast her location, those climbers wouldn't be guessing anymore. The mortars would find her ledge. She made a brutal choice. Ortiz lifted her rifle and took a shot at the buzzing speck. It was risky, small target, close range, unsuppressed. Crack! The drone jerked, wobbled, and fell out of the sky like a dead bird. But the sound gave her away. Not a pinpoint, but a direction. The climbers moved faster. Ortiz checked her ammo without looking. The weight of remaining magazines told her the truth. She was burning through time. She had to choose what to protect. The Wadi squad was still pinned, still bleeding. But the breach team, shadows moving along the wire line toward the hardened building, was closer to what the enemy truly wanted. Ortiz's eyes flicked, tracking movement near the server room corridor. She saw men moving with different purpose. Lower posture, heavier packs, not firing as much. Focused. A breach leader reached the hardened door, pulled something from his bag. Charges, likely, hand steady despite chaos. That door mattered. Ortiz's pulse slowed as her mind narrowed to one point. She fired. Crack. The breach leader's body snapped and dropped, hands spilling the charge kit onto the ground. The men around him hesitated. Confusion rippled. Someone shouted. They dragged him backward. The breach stalled. On the ridge, the climbers were closer now. Ortiz heard stones shift, heard a whispered call, heard the scrape of boots on rock. They were hunting her. Below, comms were partially back. Enough for a quick reaction force to begin moving. Enough for air support to be spun up. But it would take minutes. Minutes Ortiz might not have. The enemy commander realized his plan was unraveling. Ortiz caught him when he stepped into a gap, closer than expected, moving forward with a radio in hand, gesturing aggressively. He wore different gear, carried himself differently. Command presence. Intent. He was furious. And under pressure, he did what leaders sometimes do when plans break. He exposed himself to force movement. Ortiz held her breath. This was the turning point shot. The one that didn't just remove a gun, but broke cohesion. But the climbers were almost on top of her. She could hear their breathing now, ragged, close. She could see a muzzle poke around a rock. Bullets snapped in a stone near her head. Chips of rock stung her cheek. They were firing blind, tried to pin her while they closed. Ortiz dragged herself sideways, scraping knees and elbows against rock, shifting to a sharper angle. The world through cracked glass warped and shimmered. She forced her eye to trust it anyway. She did something that felt like insanity. She exposed herself for half a second, enough to draw their fire, enough to make them commit. The climbers leaned in, rifles bucking. Ortiz dropped back into cover and aimed through the fracture line in her optic, using the distortion like a crooked reference point. Down below, the enemy commander stepped forward again, shouting into his radio, gesturing with his free hand like he could physically shove his men back into order. Ortiz squeezed. Crack! The round hit him center mass. He staggered, surprise flashing across his face, and fell backward into dust like the valley had finally decided to take him. For a second, everything below stuttered. Then the enemy line loosened like a rope cut in the middle. Some fighters pulled back instinctively toward the jammer truck wreck, as if leadership lived there. Others surged forward without coordination, firing wildly, trying to salvage momentum. Fire discipline broke. Timing broke. The careful choreography collapsed into messy noise. That was all 2nd Platoon needed. Lieutenant Dyer, still alive by sheer stubbornness, felt it. He didn't understand the exact reason, but he felt the enemy's grip loosen. Now, he screamed into the local net. Push. Retrieve the wounded. Move. Defenders on the wall rose and fired. A fire team sprinted from the gate and dropped into the wadi, dragging Ruiz and the other wounded back toward cover. Soldiers who'd been pinned for what felt like hours suddenly found space between bullets. Ortiz tried to shift to cover them, but the climbers finally had her range. A round snapped into the rock inches from her rifle, showering her with dust. She fired once more at the closest climber, more instinct than calculation. The man dropped behind a boulder. The second climber threw something, maybe a grenade, maybe just a rock in panic, but it clattered down the slope and detonated below, harmless. Ortiz's ammo was down to the ugly part of the count. Then the valley's sound changed. A deeper thump, rhythmic approaching. Rotors. Helicopters came over the ridge line like dark angels, guided by shaky comms and desperate coordinates. Their presence alone changed the battlefield. Enemy fighters looked up, saw the future, and decided they didn't want to be in it. The remaining attackers began to withdraw, disciplined enough to pull back in elements, grabbing their wounded, detonating charges near the jammer truck to destroy evidence. Smoke thickened. Explosions popped, smaller, purposeful. Ortiz stayed on her ledge, watching retreat routes, firing only when she had to, saving the last rounds like they were minutes of life. By the time the first bird touched down inside the wire, the worst was over. The valley didn't feel peaceful. It felt exhausted. And so did she. Dawn broke fully, as if the sun had waited for permission. Smoke rose from impact craters. The outpost yard was torn up, scattered with debris and spent casings, medic wrappers flapping in the wind. A stretcher line formed near the TOC, bodies moving through hands like an assembly line of survival. Ortiz climbed down from the ridge with her rifle slung and her legs trembling now that adrenaline no longer held them. She moved like an old woman for a moment, each step careful, then forced herself straight again because she refused to be seen breaking. Near the triage area, Ruiz lay on a litter, leg wrapped tight, face pale but alive. His eyes found her, and he managed a crooked grin. "Sergeant," he rasped, "you picked a hell of a time to not follow orders." Ortiz tried to answer, but her throat was tight. She settled for a nod. Inside the TOC, which now smelled like blood and burnt electronics, Lieutenant Dyer sat at a table staring at his hands like he didn't recognize them. When Ortiz entered, his head lifted slowly, eyes red-rimmed, full of something heavier than gratitude. In the corner, an intel team was already working, hard drives, cables, fragments of gear laid out like evidence at a crime scene. The ruined jammer truck's antenna parts sat on the floor, bent and blackened. Captured documents were being translated in hurried murmurs. Captain Harlan stood with a senior officer who had arrived with the QRF. Their faces were grim with the kind of anger that comes after you realize how close you came to losing everything. Harlan looked at Ortiz like he didn't know whether to chew her out or shake her hand. The senior officer spoke first, voice flat. "Sergeant Ortiz, you were ordered to depart with the convoy." "Yes, sir." "And instead you jumped off a moving vehicle and climbed a ridge alone during an active assault." "Yes, sir." The silence stretched. Ortiz could feel every eye in the room. Isolation again, familiar tight. The senior officer held up a folder. "Intelligence confirms the enemy's objective wasn't just casualties. They were aiming for this." He tapped the folder. A schematic of the hardened server room. Notes. A list of file names labeled ISR. Drone footage, signals logs, pattern of life data. They wanted to breach the server room, he continued. Steal and wipe drone surveillance before their larger push next week. They timed this attack during rotation, jammed external comms, and used pre-plotted mortar grids. That's a competent enemy plan. Ortiz kept her face still. Inside, her stomach sank. They'd been watched, studied, patterned. The senior officer looked at her. "And you disrupted it." Harlan cleared his throat. "She also reported pattern breaks before contact," he said, almost reluctantly. "Missing civilians. Rock pile near the culvert. Possible observation glass." It was not acted on with urgency. Dyer flinched, eyes dropping. Guilt had a physical weight. Ortiz didn't say, "I told you." She'd learned that sentence didn't bring people back. The senior officer studied her a moment longer, then said, "You realize what you did could have gotten you killed." "Yes, sir." "And you realize abandoning the convoy is technically." "Yes, sir." He paused. Then his voice softened by a fraction. "But you also bought time. You took out their sniper, their spotter, their jammer array, their breach leader. And their commander, Dyer added quietly, like he couldn't believe it. The senior officer nodded once. Their cohesion broke after that shot. Your unauthorized repositioning prevented them from reaching the server room before air arrived. Ortiz felt something twist in her chest. Relief, maybe, but also a strange emptiness. She had done what she had to do. It didn't feel heroic. It felt necessary. Harlan exhaled. Ortiz, he said, voice rough. Why? That was the question underneath everything. Why turn back when the deployment was over by morning? Why jump off the truck when freedom was 12 miles away? Ortiz's fingers tightened on her rifle sling. A memory surfaced, body bag, boot, zipper, like the valley refused to let her bury it. I've ignored pattern breaks before, she said finally, voice low. Not because I didn't see them, because I followed protocol anyway. No one spoke. Ortiz looked at the table, at the scattered evidence, at the faces of men who were alive because someone had chosen improvisation over orders. I didn't want to watch it happen again, she finished. The senior officer's gaze held hers a moment longer. Then he nodded. We'll talk paperwork later, he said. Right now, go get checked by medical. That's an order. Yes, sir. Outside, Ortiz walked past the hardened server door. It was scuffed, marked by near misses but intact. Guards stood tighter now, eyes sharper, as if they finally understood what mattered. She stepped into the yard where dawn light made everything too clear. Bodies moved. Medics shouted. Helicopter rotors faded into the distance, carrying wounded away. Ruiz called her name again from his litter. Hey, he rasped. You know what the worst part is? Ortiz leaned closer. Ruiz's grin turned into a wince. You turned back, right when you were almost free. Ortiz swallowed. Because he wasn't wrong. Her deployment was stamped complete. She had been 12 hours from leaving, from stepping onto a plane and pretending the valley didn't exist. And yet she had turned back. Not because she loved war. Because the war didn't care about her timeline. Because pattern breaks didn't wait for paperwork. Later, when the outpost quieted enough for silence to exist again, Ortiz walked down to the culvert. The rock pile was still there, half scattered now, exposing the ugly intention underneath. Sandbags scraped dirt, the imprint where the machine gun had been set. She nudged a stone with her boot and watched it tumble into dust. Small things, she thought. A missing group of kids. A fresh pile of rocks. A glint of glass. That was all it took to decide who went home and who got zipped into a bag. Behind her, the valley held its breath again, pretending it was calm. Ortiz looked up at the ridgeline she'd climbed, the impossible route that had become her only option, and felt her hands begin to shake now that no one needed them steady. Fear finally arrived when the work was done. She let it, for a moment. Then she exhaled and forced her shoulders down, because she knew what would happen next. Reports would be written. Lessons would be extracted. Her impossible angle would become a contingency route on a whiteboard. Someone would brief it like it had always been obvious, and the world would move on. Ortiz stood in the early light, alone but not invisible anymore, the rifle's weight familiar against her back. Her deployment had been supposed to end at sunrise. But some operators didn't get to clock out clean. They just chose, one more time, to turn back when everyone else was leaving.